Hello, dear webinar participants. It's a pleasure to see so many of you. We thank you for joining us for this packed webinar. We hope that you will learn from our panelists and actively contribute to the conversation. I am Ezana Haddis, researcher at the African Cities Research Consortium. I'm going to be chairing this webinar entitled How Can Knowledge and Evidence Catalyze Urban Reform Coalitions? For those who are unfamiliar with African Cities Research Consortium in its acronym ACRC, it is a 6-year FCDO-funded research program that's seeking to generate new knowledge and operationally relevant evidence to address intractable development challenges in African cities. ACRC's theory of change identifies, one of the key factors enabling inclusive urban reform as coalition building among diverse stakeholders, particularly by actively involving organized disadvantaged groups. Here at ACRC, we conceptualize urban reform coalitions as groups of diverse stakeholders, potentially involving civil society, groups, state agencies, private enterprises, organized community groups who perceive benefits in coming together for different lengths of time to achieve a common goal or a common agenda. Based on this understanding of urban reform coalitions, we have been engaged in advancing the theoretical and strategic understanding of urban reform coalitions. Recently, in mid-June this year, we organized a 3-day international conference in Manchester on the role of reform coalitions for equitable, inclusive, and sustainable urban outcomes. Building on those deliberations from the June conference, today we'll discuss what role academics, action researchers, and professionals could play in fostering the formation and the functioning of urban reform coalitions. In doing so, for today, we'll give a special focus how knowledge and evidence can catalyze urban reform coalitions. We are going to start things off shortly with a presentation by Shalini Sinha. Shalini Sinha is WIEGO's Urban Asia lead and home-based work sector specialist. WIEGO is Women in International Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. Shalini will highlight the role of WIEGO in facilitating knowledge co-production in the I2 Delhi campaign and the key takeaways from their role in the campaign. Shalini will be followed by Catherine Sutherland, an associate professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She will share her experience and key lessons in knowledge co-production with disadvantaged groups in Durban, South Africa. Then Paul Mukwaya, coordinator of Urban Action Lab and an academic at the University of Makerere, will briefly present Urban Action Lab's efforts and key lessons in supporting reform coalition building and co-producing knowledge with disadvantaged groups. After the 3 panelists' presentation, we will open the discussion for questions and answers. If you have any questions and reflections, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can raise your digital hands if you want to deliver your intervention verbally, but we'll see if this is possible. In my role as chair, I will ensure that any of the questions that you put in the chat box will be put to the panelists afterwards and be addressed. But before we start, I would like to kindly remind you to mute yourselves to avoid unnecessary disturbances and noises. And I would like also to kindly inform you that we'll be recording the proceedings of the webinar, and hopefully we'll make the video available for all those people who were not able to attend the webinar. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Shalini Sinha. Shalini, you have 8 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to speak about, I hope I'm audible. I'm going to speak about a campaign that we ran in Delhi along with a host of partners. It was called I Too Am Delhi, Let's Make the City Together. And the campaign actually was built around the new master plan that the city was making. And it brought together 40 plus activists, researchers, academics, civil society organizations, collectives, with the goal of engaging with the master plan in the hope that the master plan would be more inclusive and participatory, inclusive in its writing and implementation, and participatory in its writing and implementation subsequently. So why did we, before I go there, I want to introduce my own work, which is around informal livelihood. And so our engagement around the master plan was around livelihood, but there were several others who were representing different constituencies and different issues. And those were, it could be around gender, it could be around transport, it could be around housing, but all of it came from marginalized groups. So so even though we had a very diverse set of partners coming together, I think the core that brought us all together was to be able to contribute towards an inclusive city. And that city then, and that process then we thought could come through the master plan. Now, the master plan, as you know, is a statutory instrument. It sort of decides how the city is going to be built, allocates spaces for different kind of activities. But on the other hand, for the livelihood groups, it is also often cited, even for housing. For livelihood groups, it's often cited as cited for evictions and penalization, etc. So for our own advocacy for informal workers, which are 80% of the total workers in the city of Delhi, it was important that we engage in this process. And in our efforts to engage in this process, we were part of this coalition. As I said, it had very diverse membership. It had 40 plus members, and it was loose, not registered, but we started in 2019 and came together several times for several activities. I will explain that a little bit later. As I said, the three main pillars were livelihood, gender, and housing, but it did also include many other aspects of it. Now, in 2019, when we started off, one of the first issue that we wanted to talk about was get the people's voices in. And so the initial phase of 2019 of starting then was not because the window of giving inputs to a draft master plan was open then. That opened in 2022. We started in 2019 because it was heard that a think tank had been contracted out to draft the master plan. And we thought it a simultaneous process of creating knowledge, which would then feeding into the whole writing of the master plan rather than waiting for the draft master plan to be out there and then give feedback. So we started off with the whole process of, having public meetings, gathering information from the grassroots up, but then converting them into knowledge products, which not only depicted the real issues from the ground, but also gave very concrete kind of inputs into, it talked about how to not just a manifesto of demands, but more emphasis on how, and also using the planning language. The coalition had different strategies at different time, and in the initial stages, it was created a knowledge product, used it to influence the drafters of the master plan, people who were writing it in formal, informal meetings, presentations, etc. And once the draft master plan was out, then the strategy of the campaign also changed in that we then became actual participants of the master plan and went in and gave input on the master plan. So that's a very, very brief historical trajectory of how the coalition worked. Next, please. So here I'm going to now talk about the key lessons that we wanted to produce. First of all was that, the whole technocratic nature of knowledge, of, planning as a technical object that is used, this view is used to exclude many marginalized people. And many a times people who are living on the margins have an idea of what they want from the city, how they want the city, but are often not able to translate it into technical. So I think one of the technical planning or articulate it into a technical planning language. So the first thing was to demystify the technical, to talk about the master plan to decode it for our grassroots partners, and then to take the partners' inputs into a kind of propositions that we wanted from the plan, and that therefore, so the reclaiming the technical and saying that, master plan can be a space for negotiation for better designing for a better city, and that can be done through a coalition is, I think, what we tried to do. The diverse coalition partners with different strengths came in very, very handy for us, because we wanted to talk in the language of the planning. We wanted to talk about how. We wanted to talk about, we wanted to actually give very concrete suggestions which could be included into the draft planning paper itself. And in order to do that, we were really this coalition which had researchers, academics, practitioners, as well as activists, as well as the community. And there was a lot of information and knowledge flow between them, and a churning that happened over the process at different phases for what was needed. And it translated into different knowledge products. So many of them you will see on our website. They are called fact sheets, they are called technical reports, they are called media things. Let me give you media sheets, but let me give you the example of one of the first knowledge products that we produced. And there was a host of them, more than 15 or 18 of them, which was called a fact sheet. A fact sheet, this name was chosen very specifically. It was a fact sheet. It was not a manifesto of demands. The fact sheet was supposed to be about one issue. So it could be about one sector of informal livelihood, like street vendor. It had facts and data at one end. It had challenges that the sector faced, and then it had a set of recommendations. Now, the challenge was to sort of do it in a way in which we were able to make it accessible both to the communities that we were talking to, but also to the planning norm and the planners. So that itself was a challenge in which repeatedly the activists and the scholars came together to articulate in a way which addressed both these group of audience. The nature of the coalition and the nature of the writing and the spaces of negotiation we got had made the alliance to be very nimble on its feet. It was not one strategy that we followed through this thing. Knowledge production was one strategy, but the nature of knowledge products that were produced during the campaign also varied. So I gave you an example of fact sheet. And then when the draft master plan came out, there's another example of intervention of people going in and engaging with the plan and giving their comments to the plan. And the coalition was able to give as many as 20,000 odd, and these were communities. But then that happened because the draft master plan was also quite technical, even when it was written. But the coalition, because of its various actors, was able to decode it to the community, take it to the community, and then help the community to participate in giving their feedback. Of course, and grounded in the whole coalition was the grassroots accountability and autonomy. We started with consultation with the grassroots communities, and we continue to do that even as more and more researchers, etc., aligned with us. And so the center of the knowledge product remained the coalition, and it remained this group of people who were keeping this knowledge for a particular purpose. It was not it was not something that was supposed to be in any way sort of academically oriented, but it was for the purpose of this kind of advocacy. Subsequently, we see that many of the products that we have produced, knowledge products, and our own work, we have been writing about it, and our partners who are from academics and researchers have been writing about it, using it for theorizing and for other further research. But so have our grassroots partners who have been using these products for advocacy, for getting their demands, for asking for their demands. So there is this mixing of practice and a theory and mixing of practice, which determined the nature of the campaign, but it also laid the foundation of a strong movement and also subsequent local struggles, which will follow in the implementation of this master plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shalini. It's an interesting work. Following Shalini, Catherine, you have the floor. You have 8 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the African Cities Research Consortium for inviting me to chat to you today. It's really given me a space to think about the role of researchers, or as we are in academia, our role in these urban reform coalitions. And so I'd like to talk to you about our case study. It's the Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project in Durban. And you can see the catchment here in the map. It's quite a small catchment. It's a river that runs over about 27 kilometers through the inner core of our city. And it enters one of the largest rivers in Durban, the Mgeni River, at this point where we have the Quarry Road West informal settlement. And here on the right-hand side, you can see a map that shows the informal settlement that I and my research team work a lot in to participate in this Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project. And I must say that this work isn't just work of my own that I'm presenting today. This knowledge that I'm presenting today comes from the communities that live in the settlement and also from my team of researchers at UKZN. So what's interesting about this catchment project is you might wonder, how do rivers or how do catchment rehabilitation projects become framed as urban reform coalition projects? And I think what we've realized in Durban is that our city is a city of rivers. And we began to realize that the rivers hold, they capture, they move, and they deal with a wide range of unmanaged risks in our city. So many of the urban challenges we experience come through the catchments and are actually reflected then in the rivers. And that can be pollution, sanitation runoff from poor stormwater management, solid waste, and also interestingly, they absorb the excess or the people moving into our city that don't have access to adequate housing. So many of our informal settlements where people are claiming the right to the city are on riverbanks in high precarious spaces, but that's because it's marginal land and that's where they can establish themselves in the city. So in fact, rivers are even holding the spaces for urban informality in the city. So this urban reform coalition has been going on for 10 years. And through this project and other similar ones with different kinds of governance models, we started to realize there was a process of urban reform happening through our rivers and our catchments that would really enable a city to address some of its key challenges. And these programs have come together, or these projects, I should say, have come together under Durban's Transformative Riverine Management Program that was launched in 2021. And this program is interesting because what it looks at is how do we use ecological infrastructure or ecosystem services to support the built infrastructure in our city? How do we support community-based ecosystem adaptation, which is a key focus of adaptation and climate adaptation in our city? And most importantly, what these projects do is that they create social learning and they create partnerships between the state and citizens. And through engaging in these catchment rehabilitation projects, we start to see different relationships forming by a wide range of actors who actually exist in the catchment. And you can see in this catchment, we've got formal settlements, we've got an industrial park, we've got wastewater treatment works, informal settlements, a Palmeek Nature Reserve, the university, all of these different activities in one catchment. And so a wide range of stakeholders that come into the space. And as I said, my work focuses mainly in this informal settlement, but we actively engaged in all parts of the catchment. And so who are all the actors that are part of this urban reform coalition? Well, it's the state through a wide range of departments, largely led by climate protection branch, but also coastal stormwater and catchment management. We've been able to draw human settlements in, environmental health, the water and sanitation department. We also have local community and forums from the middle class suburbs of this catchment, which is quite interesting. They come through as ratepayers associations or conservancies. And then we have a group of community-based researchers that we've trained in this community, as well as community members who actively participate in this project. And what's amazing is that last week we had our Palmeek Catchment Rehabilitation meeting, and still after 10 years, even though this is a voluntary process and we really are still struggling, I don't know that the water quality in this river is any better than when we started, but we have achieved certain important things in this work. We had 50 people in a Wednesday morning meeting coming from the municipality, coming from these community groups, from the university, and very actively engaged around the action plan that we've established for this catchment and arguing and contesting about what should be happening in the city. So it's amazing to think that after 10 years, you can still fill a room with actively engaged citizens and the state who are trying to look forward to how we can reform our city. So next slide, please. What I thought to do was to reflect on what is the role of researchers? Where do we fit into these processes? And what I wanted to start off with is that to explain that as researchers, we're actually embedded in these urban reform coalitions ourselves. So we're very much part of one of the actor groups that participate in these coalitions. But I think we need to reflect on, and this is particularly around the knowledge production part of what the seminar is focused on, is that because it's around knowledge production, we do hold a privileged position in these urban reform coalitions in relation to knowledge. And so we need to think about how we exercise our power very wisely, because we play the role of intermediaries or bridges. And what I mean by that is that we have the ability to shift discourses. So we've seen in this particular project, we've been able to reframe the state's understanding of informality and informal settlements in the city. And at the same time, we've been able to reframe by working in co-production processes with the informal community, their understanding of the state and what is possible for the state. What can the state actually do? What can they do in driving their own development forward? We've also been able to humanize the ideas for the city around what it means to live in an informal settlement and to be part of the urban fabric and how the city responds to that. And very importantly, I think we play a key role in negotiating and perhaps shifting some of the positionality of gatekeepers. The key sort of gatekeepers in this catchment are sometimes the political gatekeepers who play off their politics in these spaces, but also sometimes these very conservative ratepayer groups who have a very particular view of the city. We also co-produce knowledge with marginalized communities, I think in a way as researchers that brings the kind of issues and challenges they face into an idea of a research process. So what we've tried to do with the community in that informal settlement that we work with, and they are co-producing knowledge, they are raising the issues and challenges that they face, but they're not just raising them as issues, we're reframing them with them to set them as research questions. And those research questions reflect their reality and their needs, but because they're framed in the way of research questions, they're able to speak to science and policy. And so they transfer more easily into the kind of language and knowledge base of the state. We also are able to produce and work with different kinds of methodologies and technologies because of our position in the research space and as academics. And so through this form of new kinds of methodologies, we work with communities to, again, translate what they know into policy-relevant data and formats. And the examples we have there is that we used photo voice, for example, to work on a Narratives of Home project, where we used images and narratives of living in an informal settlement to communicate to the city what it means. What does home and place mean when you live in an informal settlement? And so when we faced the floods in Durban in 2019 and 2022, This brought a new lens to climate-induced mobility and how the state should respond to rehousing these informal residents because they understood their narratives of home. We also did GIS mapping with the community, and we discovered that the state's database said that there were about 450 houses in that settlement. And of course, that was outdated. So through a participatory GIS process, and part of the mapping, that first map that I showed you, that risk-based map that we did, was part of that participatory GIS mapping. And we then got to the point that actually there were 1,100 households in that settlement, which both empowered the state and the community, because they weren't aware how many households they were had within their own community, around what is the planning when we face risk in that informal settlement community, and what are we dealing with. And then another important point I've been thinking about for a while is that I think that as academics, we are able to understand that different knowledges manage over space and time. As researchers, we're able to read the context and we're able to read the landscape. We're interested in the connections between things. So we can shape, in a sense, how and which knowledge moves and what time and where. Even just the idea of Diana Mifflin creating this sort of knowledge base of urban reform coalitions has created an analytical framework that gives a home and some power to the knowledge that we're producing in the spaces that we're working in. And so we can use these different knowledges over space and time in ways that actually interface with the kinds of strategies or policies that the city is working with. And then to finish off, some of the challenges is the risk of our own positionality. What is our own agency and our agenda when we are working in these spaces? And sometimes my team within the city are known as tame social scientists because we work with the state, we partner with the state. So what does it mean when we are less critical social scientists? Well, I think we are critical actually, but we get framed as tame social scientists because we're trying to build relationships or partnerships between the state and citizens. And of course, we've got to continue to obtain funding, because it's through using our funding that we can draw in different actors into the space or different knowledge bases so that we can try and support this urban reform coalition going forward. And so I think one of the things that we really need to understand is about how, as researchers, we stay on the road with communities. They're going to continue living in that informal settlement for many years to come. The chances of them being relocated are very slim. So how do we use what we can do to stay the long distance? Because really to create this kind of transformation probably will take us 20, 30, 40 years, and we've got to stay the distance. So thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to the other presentations and the debate that we'll be having. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I will call upon Paul. Paul, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to the group and all the participants. Paul Mukwaya, my name's I'm coming from a university-based lab. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Geography, Geo-informatics, and Climatic Sciences, but I also lead activities in the Urban Action Lab. The Urban Action Lab is about 15 years old and informed by then UN Habitat that was interested in having a home in universities with regard to climate change and urban development, especially in higher education institutions. That's where we started, but we have evolved as a space, we've evolved as a platform, and we've also evolved as a research group. We are moving into a number of actors, a wide spectrum of actors, and therefore our belief in the Urban Action Lab is that knowledge resides within communities. And therefore questions of the methodology that we take out there to speak to communities is that we engage a lot with community science. They are the data collectors, they are the data analysts, and the best possible and appropriate methodologies that originate within the communities are very important for us. So the Urban Action Lab, again, has engaged with quite a number of reform coalitions. Some of these speak directly to a broad range of urban-related issues, but some of the issues are issue-specific. For example, we have the National Transport Consultative Forum. You could have the Gulf Association of Kampala, you could have the Uganda Pit Emptiers Association, you could have the Platform for Vendors in Uganda, but there are those that are broadly into the broad urban development issues, for example, the National Urban Forum. But today, I wanted to speak about the Just City and Informality Working Group. The Just City and Informality Working Group is about 3 years old. It started informally by its nature, by its name, Informality Working Group. It started informally. And we've been moving through several stages. We used to call it the Informal Working Group. Now we are calling it the Informality Working Group, and we've just added Just City. Essentially, our interest is to speak about injustice. We're interested in speaking about disadvantaged issues, people, and wherever they are. We speak about broader informality concerns. And of course, we are operating in a very unequal space that is typical of Kampala City. Now, this informality working group was an initiative from Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation. It's a German organization, an advocacy group. But what we've done is to divide ourselves into 4 sub-work groups. 4 work groups, one that speaks directly to informal trade, another that speaks directly on informal housing, another speaks on informal basic service delivery, and the 4th group speaks directly on informal transportation. And what the Informality Working Group does is to bring together communities, community groups, society, all societies, that civil society, academia, and several urban development practitioners. And our interest, again, largely to improve the lives of citizens. And for emphasis, areas of injustice, areas of disadvantage, areas of informality, and of course, the many unequal spaces that we have in Kampala City. So we articulate the issues that are reflecting these groups of people. But we also go ahead to advocate for good practices. Of course, Kampala City is largely over 60% of the economy is 65% is informal, and over 70% of the population is engaged in the informal sector. And therefore, what we do in the Informality Working Group is to advocate for good practices that inform broader strategic actions by the responsible duty bearers. So our interest, rather than thinking about suppressing informality, our interest is to speak directly to argue that informality is very important, and it is part and parcel of the city domain, and we therefore need to draw lessons on how we can strengthen policies and practices to ensure that we have just city futures for the whole population across the city. Next slide, Hannah. Now, what you see is, like I said, we normally work in communities. And for emphasis again, our idea is the belief that urban knowledge originates in communities. It resides there. And therefore, we work with communities to ensure that the best forms of action that we believe can change the whole city are very important. And in many of these meetings, policy briefs that we generate together with the communities, these are very, very important, and they speak directly to the issues that are very important for the community that we work with. That's some of the informal settlements that we normally work with. And what we are also advantaged with as the Urban Action Lab is that we work directly with the National Slum Dwellers Federation of Uganda that have it has a very strong footprint in these communities. And the question that we don't go out with knowledge, but we generate it with community members is something that speaks directly to the work that we do most. Next slide. But what is very important is that as we generate knowledge together with the communities, there is a need to build community capacities. Not all communities are better able to handle the community challenges. So the capacities to generate the knowledge, the capacities to seek appropriate solutions is very important, and we speak directly to this. And therefore, that engagement that we continue to have with the advocacy groups, that we have with politicians, that we have with the local leaders, that we have with the civil society organizations and several community groups is very important to identify and sieve through those community capacities that need to be built. But we are also aware that as we do this work, there is a strong political muscle that is increasingly be infiltrating our works. And we have a series of politicians that have strong links to the state. Some of these are state bureaucrats and business actors with several business interests. And we are considering these as selfish interests. And they are creating lots of leadership conflicts and quarrels. And of course, also creating rival coalitions. Even within the 3-year informality working group, we are seeing a situation where a few groups of people are creating rival coalitions, and therefore, at some point earlier this year, we were losing cohesion, and therefore difficult to increase our legitimacy. But the third thing that we are identifying as we create knowledge within communities is how do we manage the different expectations of the different groups of people in these reform coalitions. The process of coalition building is for us very hard. It requires a lot of time on the part of the Urban Action Lab, but the many actors, we need a lot of time, and of course the resources. And therefore, there is a need to think through how best can we mobilize sufficient resources so that the process is sustainable, but also we can manage the expectations better. Notwithstanding the infiltration, we are also observing a situation where the interests of members are shifting from time to time. That relates to managing expectations. So that also drills the process of properly organizing the informality working group, and of course, realizing the intended outcomes that we envisage at the end of the day. That's what I wanted to share with you, Ezana and the rest of the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, all the three presenters. If I'm forced to wrap it up, to summarize it, I could say, Shalini introduced us as how mobilization matters, and Catherine showed us that how geography matters, and Paul highlighted how politics matters. Now, I would like to open the floor for question and answers. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and also feel free to also raise your digital hand as much as possible. We'll try to give you a chance to ask the questions. Okay, we have a first question. The first question is from Lindani Mitchali from University of KwaZulu-Natal, I guess. What strategies can be employed to build and sustain cross-sectoral partnership with urban reform coalitions?
Can I come in, Ezana?
Okay.
Yes, when I think of the other two presentations today, I think they were raising some of these critical issues about how do you build these cross-sectoral strategies. And I think that, again, this importance of co-production comes to the fore, because we often think of trying to build these strategies from the outside. So how do we do this? But so often in these processes in urban reform coalitions, and I thought that was really so interesting when we looked at the work on the master plan in Delhi, is that what you see is that the kind of strategies evolve out of you engaging with the particular focus that you have. So in engaging with that master plan, a whole lot of strategies, and we heard those lovely ideas or the fact sheets that were used in different ways by different groups. So that's how knowledge was used, is that I guess you've got to have some idea of your strategy, but your strategy is almost to uphold what the kind of vision or principle of an urban reform coalition is. And then when you start to engage with the work and you start to co-produce knowledge with a wide range of actors who all, in a sense, going or should be aiming in the same direction, then your opportunities for strategies start to emerge. So I think I would say is that you've got to have some idea of the overall strategy and vision, and that's really about keeping the actor network together. But as you co-produce knowledge, then what happens is in this engagement with each other, you find, I mean, like that GIS mapping, that emerged out of our work, that was something that community and the state needed. And so we went down that road. So often you've got to be able to be open enough to create strategies and processes that do become cross-sectorial by engaging with all of those actors in this space. So it's a little bit different to the way in which we used to working, where we have a strategy and we go and do it. These strategies are actually often emergent. I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's how I would kind of see it.
Yeah. Paul?
Ezana?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and that has come through in the work that we've done for ACRC the past about 17 months or so. Now, the idea, I think for me, it's addressing the questions of positionality, but co-production of knowledge is very important. So what we normally do, and what we've done as the Urban Action Lab, is for these many actors, if the actors, the communities, can identify with a problem, can relate with the urban challenge, if they think it's a challenge, and we ensure to communicate a message that we are all in it together, and we all have the solution to get this challenge resolved. So once the actors identify that, then they are all brought on board to ensure that we can move forward and together. So continuous engagement, that we are all in together, we are relating with the challenge, has helped us a lot. Ezana?
Thank you very much, Paul. Shalini, I'll give you a chance to respond, how to sustain this cross-sectoral partnership, but I will add another question which you can also respond together. This comes from Jennifer Houghton. I'm sorry for not pronouncing your name properly. How can coalitions respond to emerging issues that might perhaps be shifting from the initial focus of the coalitions? It relates with how to sustain coalitions. So Shalini.
So I'm going to respond from our experience of the coalition, which was trying to influence the master plan. And in a sense, our strategies changed as the master plan, as the external environment of the master plan changed. So when there was brainstorming of how it's going to be drafted, how it was going to be written, we had a different set of strategies. And when it was out, the draft master plan was out, we had a different set of strategies, even in our knowledge products that I have said. So it is important to understand what you're trying to influence at what time. So, and what is the platform that you're using? So in the initial stage, there was no platform. There was no process in which you could engage. So it was a more informal way of, influencing the writers of the master plan and saying, look, we have some facts, figures, suggestions. We'll come and tell you about it. Why don't you hear us out? Once we went there, we made sure that it was presented by a community member. So we established that the community members who were backed by scholars and academics who were part of the team, but it was the community member, the informal worker, the street vendor who was presenting, or their groups who were presenting, thus establishing that these marginalized groups can contribute as a stakeholder to the writing of the master plan. So the strategy was not just of creating knowledge product, but how to present the knowledge product that we were creating. So, and it varied. So in the, let me tell you the story of giving objections. So there is a proper institutionalized mechanism in which a window of a few weeks is given, where any citizen of Delhi can give comments, suggestions, etc. to the draft master plan, which came after 2 years. So when that opened, what happened was that we were all sort of, the draft master plan was out, we were studying, it was very, very technical, and our community groups were saying, what is it? What is written there? And so we had to do another set of engagement in which we are, the scholars, quote unquote, were able to decode the master plan into a language which the community could understand and respond to. But how were the community's response presented to the people who were writing the Delhi Development Board, which was writing the master plan? So the thing is that it was during COVID times, and they used the COVID time to reduce the window of giving presentations, said it has to be online using very sophisticated digital platforms, not Zoom, etc., but much more sophisticated Teamlease, etc., which are really which cannot be accessed by the people that we work with. So there the strategy was that at one level, you were facilitating feedback from the community, but at another level, you were also creating a medium to give that feedback. So the protests on the streets was, we want to give physical feedback in writing, no digital. We cannot do digital. There is a great digital divide in Delhi. So we want to come and give the feedback, set up a desk which can get our feedback. So I think there are two aspects to it of addressing issues. One is the whole timeline of the main issue that you are following. And the second is how you present the knowledge that you have created, co-produced, but presentation is also. And that itself, this whole process in our case actually led to cross-pollination of ideas and roles. So, housing people were also talking about home-based workers, and home-based workers were also talking about housing. But similarly, activists were speaking and community was speaking the language of the planners, and academics were speaking the language of demands. So there was a cross-pollination of ideas, cross-pollination of articulation, cross-pollination across issues as well.
Thank you very much, Shalini. We have two questions. One is from a colleague from University of Manchester, Joe Rabbit, future studies lead at Manchester Urban Institute. The questions is from Joe's work on the global peri-urban, typically a zone of land conflict, local versus global, bypassing of communities and livelihoods. So Joe is asking if, in this context of peri-urbanization, how to start building wider knowledge coalitions in such fragmented space. And the second is from Kenny Lynch from University of Gloucestershire. Thank you for the presentation. I wonder if any of the speakers could share any observations they may have on each of city settings. Kenny is interested in the age of cities and how urban process of fast-growing cities bleed into the peri-urban areas, in line with Joravitz's question. So I wonder, Kenny is wondering if any of the speakers could have any observation they may have on each of city settings, how urban coalitions work in the peripheries, in the peri-urban areas, or in the edge cities.
I don't mind having a try at answering some of those questions, Ezana. I mean, I think it's very interesting, these questions about peri-urban areas and edge of cities. So Durban is a fascinating city because 43% of our city is actually under dual governance. It's governed by municipal administration and by traditional authorities. So we have this work that we do on other forms of reform urban coalitions around the spaces where you have, again, these very conflicted spaces, very contested about how the space is being formed. And in fact, in those areas, it's literally like city building from below, where communities are building the city for themselves outside of these formal processes. And the same idea with sort of edge cities, where you create a second city adjacent to the city, and how do you bring that into the sort of, I guess, urban reform coalition idea if you're working in the sort of city frame and you've now got this edge space. But I think what you've got to try and do is you've got to look at who all your actors are in that space. And perhaps that's where, as researchers, we've got to try and be smart and almost think of hooks that you can try and bring with the state or whoever's really governing in those spaces. You've got to find the key actors that are governing. And sometimes that's out of the formal system. And you've got to try and think about how you create these kind of hooks that start bringing people into a space where collectively you can start to recognize that even though it's highly contested, and I can tell you in our Palmy Catchment project, it can be highly contested when you've got formal residents with informal settlers. But what you do is you bring people in through this hook of what is really, in a sense, a common challenge that everyone's trying to go forward. And that's kind of what you and Dana have written about in urban reform coalitions, is that you might be coming at it from different perspectives. It might be highly contested, but there's something that links everybody together. And by understanding all those actors, when we started on this project, we first had to just try and map out who all the actors were and to find clever ways. And like Shalini said, you've got to have different strategies at different times to bring in different actors so that you actually bring them together and find some hook or some issue that's going to link everybody that starts everyone engaging. And then through that, you start finding smaller partnerships forming, and then over time you can build it. And I know it sounds maybe too positive or too easy, but I really think this is how these things start. And we certainly said in our city, where some of these spaces are highly contested and highly political, that there is still this, I still believe in this idea that actually for all people, there's this kind of goodwill or this good intention to live in a good society. And then if you can find that hook where you can start seeing other people's positions and putting yourself in other people's shoes, suddenly you start seeing your city differently and you start shifting your position. And I think as researchers or in academia, we have, that was part of that privileged power that I spoke about, that I think we can read that landscape and try and create these hooks that bring everyone into the startup, at least, of a coalition. It might collapse, but at least you're starting. So that would be my response to both those questions. And sometimes we just have to try and we just have to start. And it's amazing what comes out of beginning together.
Ezana?
Paul, okay.
Yeah, these questions for me are very related, including the first one on how do you respond to emerging issues. But how do you then respond to the shifting intentions or interests of the Reform Coalition members? For example, fragmented space could also be an emerging issue. We are working in a toxic, for example, in Kampala City, a politically toxic environment. We are working in very uneven spaces. Even the question number 3 would be about edge cities would be an emerging issue. And therefore, for me, it depends on the type of coalition. In Uganda's case, or for Kampala's case, we have coalitions that are broad in nature. They address more or less all issues with regard to urban development challenges. But there are also other coalitions that are issue specific, and therefore there is no room for them to navigate into another emerging issue. And therefore, the complexity as the cities change, including having edge cities, you may not be able to create coalition after coalition. You may run into that risk of creating coalition of after coalition. But it depends, again, in my view, on what is the intention of the coalition. Is there room for it to navigate into an emerging issue, or it's as restricted as it can be? In Kampala's case, we have, for example, the National Transport Consultative Forum. That is not restricted to just the jurisdictions of Kampala City, but it addresses issues even within the surrounding municipalities. So it just gives my view that the concerns of the coalitions are very important, and therefore giving them room to navigate whatever emerging issues is coming across them. Ezana?
Thank you very much, Paul. Shalini?
Yes, I just want to add to what the other two panelists have said. Besides all the various issues, I just want to add particularly one thing to what Catherine was saying about a hook. It's important to have a hook, but also with it is also important is to deeply explore the stakeholders or people who are going to be influenced by that particular hook, because sometimes in the articulation of a problem or the solution, trying to find a solution of the problem, we may not include everybody who's influenced. For instance, city planning typically would not look at informal workers, particularly say the workers who work from their homes, because they feel that they're working from their homes, it's a labor issue, it is not a planner issue. But once you explore that context, then when the home becomes a place of work, it becomes an housing issue, it becomes a city planning issue. So I think the identification of stakeholders and identification and nuancing of the issue is equally important as one finds the hook. And second is that, if the coalition is run on sort of democratic principles, at least in maybe Delhi, we are facing this, I2M Delhi, I said the Hindi version of it. The I2M Delhi is that once the master plan comes out, will we die out? Will the coalition die out? Or will it take another form in which it will start engaging with zonal implementations, local planning? We don't know. We have to wait till it comes out, and then the coalition in its own democratic processes will have a churning within and either take a different avatar or just die out. So I think some of it is sort of trajectory of growth.
Thank you very much, Shalini. I think we have run out of time. Also, interesting things were being raised. This is, as a start, this is the first, webinar on urban reform coalitions. We are going to have from different perspectives, we are going to have successive webinars, and please tune in to follow our social media channels, LinkedIn, on Twitter, and so on. Lots of interesting things are coming out from ACRC in general, and also from a reform coalition. And also, my colleague Hannah have shared, some websites, the links to some website about the things that the panelists were raising. I like to, emphasize, some of the issues that were raised by our panelists, before closing the session. The first thing that hits me is from Shalini is that, reclaiming the technical, instead of, avoiding it, trying to work with it, but in a way that, breaks, the community's needs and aspiration, or the ability of the communities, to articulate and also maintain the momentum, to continue not only at some one campaign, but in the future. From Catherine, as researchers, as academics, we have a very privileged position So using that privileged position, wisely, using it, as an intermediary, to legitimize the knowledge produced by, communities, as well as, to build the capacity of communities to articulate their demands and their solutions in a way that is, compatible or, acceptable by state officials. And using different knowledge in different time and space. And from Paul's, managing expectations, it's really important, because when we draw different people, we come across, it's the hope of change that brings people together into a reform coalition, but change wouldn't come, right away. And managing expectation is a huge challenge in building and sustaining reform coalitions, and that requires, further investigations, and also political challenge, the challenge of being co-opted, some groups dominating, even managing conflicts is really internally within the coalition and externally as well. What Joe Rabets have shared his experience from his research, and thinking about, what reform coalition building looks like in conflict zones, and also asking the question, is building reform coalition is always necessary or relevant? Is there times where building reform coalition is important, or and then at some point it might be also not, it's not, an all solution. So these are the things that we need to think about in further research. I would like to thank all of you for attending this webinar, and also I'm so grateful for the panelists for generously sharing their experience and their key takeaways. Thank you very much. Please keep following our works, and keep in touch, and look at the websites and the links shared by my colleague Hannah about the panelists' work. There are lots of interesting things. Thank you very much.